Evita, where were you born? And tell us a little bit about your family of origin and your
Okay.
early childhood.
Um, I was born in Eagle Pass, Texas, but only because the electricity went out in Piedras Negras. So they took my mother across the border. But my family had come to Mexico in 1900. Porfirio Diaz gave them land, and they were one of the families from the South who had lost everything in the Civil War, and they moved over to Oklahoma, and then they came down, my great-grandparents came down in a group and lived in Tamaulipas. So that's how our history started.
Wow. And did you
And
grow up in Tamaulipas?
no, over in Coahuila. But that's the other part of the story. My grandfather helped make Oklahoma a state. He was a U.S. Marshal there, and he thought, and he was part of the land rush. So he came, he said it was getting too crowded in Oklahoma. So he came down to Mexico and was in Tamaulipas looking around, and he saw my grandmother and he just said, I'm going to marry her. And the man that he was riding with said, well, she's my date tonight. So anyway, my grandmother married him, and he had bought ranches in Coahuila. So they moved over to Coahuila, and they went through the revolution here, and my grandmother tells great stories about that part of her life. And so anyway, that was how we started here in Mexico. Then my mother, well, she met my father, who was a pilot and training pilots in Del Rio, Texas, in World War II. So they met, and he was from St. Louis, and both my mother and my father were fianced to other people.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
Anyway, they ended up getting married, and my father came to Mexico with my mother, and my grandmother gave him the ranch, one of them. They had two others. My uncle lived next door to us, and then my grandmother's ranch was a little further over.
So your parents are both American.
Both American, yes, but my mother was raised here, as was my uncle, both raised here, and they had a governess on the ranch teaching them until my mother went to high school up in Austin. She went up there and stayed with my great aunt, Aunt Kitty. She lived with her.
But your early childhood was in Mexico on this ranch.
Yes,
Is that right?
my early childhood, even though when I started school, or we started school, there were three brothers and me. My mother bought a house in Eagle Pass, and so we all went to primary school in Eagle Pass.
Oh,
And then we all left for boarding schools.
in the States.
I first came to Marymount, and I was 12 when I went to Marymount boarding school. And that's in
where?
Cuernavaca,
Oh, I see.
Cuernavaca,
Oh, so
Morelos, yes. So I went there and studied for a year, and then I went up to St. Mary's Hall in San Antonio, Texas.
Wow, so you're very bicultural.
Yes, and I have Mexican family and American family.
So after that, tell us more about your odyssey. Where did you go to high school and college?
Okay, I went to high school at St. Mary's Hall in Texas, and I went to Boston University in Boston. Then I became a hippie, so-called hippie, and dropped out of that. and went back to the ranch, lived on the ranch for about a year, and then moved to San Miguel.
Oh, really? From that? So what
Yeah.
first attracted you to San Miguel?
It's been a love of mine since I was very little. I mean, my aunt and uncle and cousin and I traveled to San Miguel when I was 11. And then when I went to Marymount, the nuns had a traveling club. So they had rented black Cadillacs, and these nuns would bring us around Mexico.
Oh,
And one of my first places that we stopped was San Miguel, and we stayed in the same hotel, the San Francisco, as my aunt and uncle and cousin had stayed. So I've always loved San Miguel and
So you-
Michoacan, because on my trip to Michoacan with my aunt and uncle, I wrote my mother back and said, this is my favorite state, Michoacan. But I loved San Miguel as well.
so you moved here for the first time when?
In the 70s, and I came to the Instituto Allende
To study there?
to study, both my brother and I. My mother rented us a house on Quebrada, and we both studied at the Instituto.
And so how and when did you first become interested in folk art?
My mother collected it. We had it in our ranch house all over. We had well, she had an altar to Guadalupe in the house and folk art, plus a lot of other art. She had collected a lot of art.
And now you left San Miguel after the 70s, right? And where did you
I
go
stayed 2 years. Oh, I decided to go study Montessori in England.
then? Oh,
So
my.
I studied that and lived in England, London for 2 years.
And then you came back to San Miguel.
No, I moved to Piedras Negras
Oh,
and started teaching Montessori
oh.
for a year.
Well, then
For a
tell us
year.
the evolution of your store here. When did you move back here, and how did you
Okay.
start your store?
Well, I had been living in San Antonio after moving from Piedras Negras up to San Antonio. And I had been working in a museum with folk art. They had some folk art collections, the San Antonio Museum Association. And they allowed me to look at those collections because I spoke Spanish and could help them translate. And so then, working there with folk art, I started, I saw that my mother's pieces were wonderful and collectible. And so I decided to start coming to San Miguel because I had a friend here, and I'd stay with her and then go on to villages and start collecting. And I took it back for a while to San Antonio, but decided the U.S. isn't really my home. Oh dear. But so that's when I moved back in '88. I
In
moved
88,
back
moved back to San Miguel.
to San
And
Miguel,
decided to open your store here.
and I
instead.
opened it 2 months after I got here.
In the same location where you
Same
are now?
location.
Are you renting that space?
I'm renting that space from a family whose father was my mother's cardiologist, so I've known the family a long time too.
And you've had that shop for many years now.
35.
35
Yes,
years.
I've had
Wow.
it 35.
Do you still travel around?
I
to
still
buy
travel
art?
to buy. Yes, I
Uh-huh.
still do.
And
That's the fun part, as you know.
yeah, that's right.
That's the fun part.
Definitely. And does your collection have a specific emphasis, like a different area of Mexico or vintage, or do you?
All areas. Well, I think if you have a folk art gallery, you have old and new, old, vintage, new.
So when you travel, do you close your store, or how
I
does that
just
work?
close it.
Oh, wow.
And go.
And go on trips.
Right, and go on trips.
And people bring you things sometimes too, probably?
Never once
Oh.
have I had anyone bring me anything that I would consider as collectible or interesting or
Is that
something that I want to have in my shop.
Oh, my. That surprises me a little bit because you've been here so long, I would think.
Right.
People, wow.
And it hasn't been my luck, really, that they've brought me anything that I really wanted.
So I know that a lot of times you wear these beautiful huipiles from
Right.
Amuscos, Oaxaca.
No,
So-
it's actually Guerrero.
Oh, it's in Guerrero.
Yes,
Guerrero.
I wear them because they're more detailed and more interesting to me than some of the Oaxacan ones, which are very simple. So I wear the Amuzgo, and I've worn the Amuzgo since I worked at the museum.
Oh,
So a
nice.
long time,
Yeah.
a long time.
Is there a story about how you first found that town? Do you go there to buy the huipiles?
I've never been there.
Oh,
She comes up to me. She used to.
oh,
She used to come up to San Miguel, actually.
oh.
And I had a wonderful couple, you know, Juan Macuset and his wife Josefina. They are the ones that helped me meet Margarita, who would bring the huipiles up from Guerrero.
Is that right? It's all
Right.
connections, but you've actually never been there. Wow.
I've never been there. I want to go, but I've never been.
Because they're so
Well, they have a
beautiful.
cooperative, and they represent many of the women that live in the village. And it's pretty remote. I mean, it is in Guerrero, way down there.
Yeah,
So, it's very remote.
yeah. So it's hard to get to.
Yeah, hard to get to.
So, what are some of your favorite memories from the good old days? You know, when you first moved here or when you came back in '88. Give us some stories about what it was like then.
Well, when I came back in the 70s and studied at the Instituto, one of my favorite memories was a wonderful man, Miguel Malo, who was my Mexican history professor. And he was brilliant. He was such a wonderful man, and he loved Mexico. So, of course, he's gone now, and his collection, part of it, is up in the Allende Museum upstairs, his pre-Columbian collection.
Oh.
And that was an interesting history. He started collecting those pieces because all of those were being looted in this area. And he kept telling the Instituto de Antropología, you need to come up, or Arqueología, you need to come up and start preserving these pieces, but they never came. So he started collecting them, and he then, well, the laws changed in Mexico, and they made them national patrimony, all of the pre-Columbian pieces. And so they came and took his collection away from him.
Oh.
And so he committed suicide.
Oh.
He was so distraught that they would come. I mean, here he was trying to preserve it. And so anyway, he committed suicide.
Oh,
And it was horrible.
dear. Because they confiscated his
Because they
collection?
confiscated his whole collection. And this collection in the Museo Allende was just recovered, and it's only part of his collection.
Wow.
So it's nice to have it back here.
Because I think now, if you register your collection, you can keep it, but it doesn't belong to you,
Yes.
but you can keep it. They've changed that. Maybe.
They've changed the laws.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was when they just started saying that pre-Columbian pieces were national patrimony.
The auditorium in Bellas Artes is named Miguel Malo Auditorium.
It's after him.
Wow.
It's after.
So he was very influential here.
Yes, he was. He was from one of the old families.
Wow.
And I rent from his parientes.
Oh.
His, he's related to the family that I rent my store from.
When you moved here in the 70s, did the outer colonias exist at that
They
time?
didn't. No,
They
they didn't.
So Guadalupe and Independencia didn't even exist?
Not really, no. There might have been a few houses, but nothing like now.
And when you came back in the 80s, were they more developed? Or
A
was
little
it
more
still,
developed, but still not as much like San Antonio.
Was it controversial at the time? Did people worry that San Miguel's getting too big? Or?
No, I don't think they were worried about that. But I do have two other good memories of the 70s. When I was studying at the Instituto, there was only one telephone in town. So if my mother called me from northern Mexico or from the States or wherever she called me from, they would have to send a person to go get me. And I would go to where El Coronel, that place is, and that was where they had the phones, and they had these little booths that you could receive your call. So that was interesting, no phones.
Wow.
And they would turn the lights on with, the street lights on with a large pole and turn them on. So those were two of my favorite memories.
Wow. They were electric
Lights,
too.
but they had to turn them on with a pole. They weren't.
And did you have some friends, really important special friends from that era?
I did.
That people we might have heard of?
Probably Judy Roberts. I'm sure you've heard of her.
Oh yeah, she had a store, clothing store.
Yeah, she
Very
did.
special
And
for
she
her.
designed jackets and beautiful things. She was a very talented person and also collected folk art.
Did you
She
meet
and
her
I,
here? Here in
she and
San
I
Diego?
traveled. Well, she was at the Instituto also. And she and I traveled to some different villages.
So in those early days in the 70s and then you came back in the 80s, did you participate in the festivals like the Dia de los Locos and Semana Santa, and did you get involved in those? Or do you
Yeah, I
enjoy
would
them?
watch them and enjoy them, yeah, for sure.
Was that part of the appeal?
I love rituals, yes, and traditional ritual, yes. So it was definitely part of the appeal.
Because I think those holidays are celebrated with more gusto in San Miguel than in many other places.
That's true, that's true.
So we've all heard about this custom where in the Jardín the girls would walk in one direction and the boys
Yes.
would walk in another direction.
Yes.
Was that happening when you were here?
Yes.
And do you remember that?
And my friend Mary Jane Miller met her husband that way.
Oh, she did.
She did, and I think it was the first day she got here.
Oh.
I think, if I remember correctly.
Did you ever participate in that?
No, no.
But you'd watch it.
I'd watch it, but I never was part of the, part of
Do you have
it.
any idea why that, when that stopped or why?
I don't. I really don't.
Because we've all heard about that tradition.
Oh, yeah, and as you know, they change. So
Yeah, who changed?
the traditions change.
Yeah,
Yeah, and they
definitely.
stop doing them.
Do you remember when Banamex acquired the Canal residence?
I don't.
Oh.
No, I don't know
Because-
if I was here then.
Because I've also heard that the La Cucaracha bar was on that corner in that building.
Yes,
Do you
I
remember
used to
that?
go to it.
You did?
I used to. I loved it.
Oh yeah, tell us
And
about
I
that.
loved the owner, and well, there were always writers there and interesting people that you could meet, and we all went there. It was just a meeting place, and loved it.
That's such a tradition here. And I would
Uh-huh.
have thought that when Banamex put banks in there, people would have been upset with that. But you don't remember that?
No, I don't. I really don't. Because the kook moved away when I wasn't in town.
Uh-huh. I see.
So I just wasn't aware of it all.
Where are your favorite areas to travel to buy folk art?
Probably Michoacan and Oaxaca. No, I like Puebla too. I like the highlands of Puebla. There's a lot of traditional ritual up there, so I like the highlands as well.
Any special art that really captivates you from those areas? Or towns? I mean, Michoacan's big, so do you go right around Pátzcuaro or
Oh,
other areas?
I actually started my business up in Ocomicho,
Oh,
which was very isolated at that point. And I started selling Ocomichos first. That's one of the first things I would take back to the U.S.
oh, when you were still selling in San
when I
Antonio.
was selling in San Antonio before I moved back.
Because it's very distinctive.
Yes. And it was in those days. I won't sell one now unless it's an old piece.
Oh, why do you say why?
Because it's changed so much. And in those days, it was really beautiful stuff. I mean, really quite different from some of the things they're churning out now. That's only my opinion, and I know a lot of people disagree with me.
Well, now, why do you think of Okomichu, the mermaids around
Well,
the
there were
Last
always,
Supper?
there were always those, but they were just more artistic, more aesthetically
Yeah,
pleasing than they are now.
right, right.
And they would depict a lot of interesting things, like the Christ figure that has all the little heads on it.
Oh,
And
right.
it was scriptural. It was, we the people are the body of Christ. There was a lot of scriptural pieces that were quite interesting. But that was one of my most interesting pieces from there.
Were they making the green pineapples in San Jose Gracia at that time?
Yeah, they were. They were making them.
At that time. And did you buy those? No.
I went up to Patamba
Uh-huh,
and bought up there.
uh-huh.
And I love their greenware. And I went to a fabulous Cristo Rey ritual up there. And I stayed the night with one of the men I bought from. I stayed in his house with his deaf-mute sister.
Oh, my.
But they understood each other. It was really interesting. He would say, just talk to her, and they understood each other totally. She knew exactly what he meant and what he wanted. And so anyway, I stayed with them, and then I woke up there with these amazing Gregorian chants. And they were building the streets with the sand and the flowers. And just beautiful work. So I enjoyed that experience a lot.
And are there any other families that you were especially close to that you bought from over the years?
In
Any of these villages?
Oh yeah, there are a lot. There are a lot of families, but so many of them had died. Antonio, the man I stayed with, is gone now, and I mean, it's just quite a few that I bought from and sold have now died.
Because you're really a legend in San Miguel with your folk art store that you've had for so long here. You're kind of Miss Folk Art,
Miss Folk Art.
Senora Folk Art.
Hardly. I don't think of myself as a legend at all. But I have one more really wonderful memory about the bees and how they collect the beeswax. I was in Ocomicho, and one of the houses, the owner came out and started ringing his little bell. And I said, well, why are you ringing that bell? And he said to call in my bees. So he called in his bees with the bell. And in my later travels, I found a nicho with a saint in it, ringing a bell. He had a little bell.
Oh.
And I said to the dealer, I said, oh, that's a saint of the bees. And she said, how did you know? But that's because I had experienced it.
Look at that.
And then I found another nicho from another area, the Huasteca, and it was another saint of the bees. And I loved how close to nature these villages lived with. I think it's changed a lot now, but in those days when I started, that real connection with nature was pretty fabulous.
But what are the changes that you like that have happened here?
Probably the choice in restaurants.
Yeah.
And the availability of things that were never, ever available here.
Now you can have a phone in your home.
Well, and I can have a phone, and I can have internet, and
Yeah.
all of those things, and the cell phone. And a lot of my artisans actually send me photos on their cell phones.
Yeah. Oh, yes, of course.
So that's how I've been buying some too, is
yeah, that's
or
something
ordering on cell phone.
we've noticed too.
What's
in
that?
all these villages, everyone has a cell phone.
Everyone.
They might have a very humble abode, but they all have a cell phone.
They all have a
It's
cell
changed-
phone.
Transformed the world.
Yes, it sure has.
Well, Evita, I've enjoyed this very much. Thank you for giving us your story.
Thank you.